Good morning, beautiful. I love it. I learned that now. I'm never going to forget it. Thank you very much to Rosanna and Christy and the Women's Leadership Council for inviting me to this event. I'm really impressed that there's so many of you out here celebrating women and their leadership skills. And I hope that I can tell you some interesting things about my life in education and how that had some implications for leadership. I'm thinking about the tools that Rita told you about, and what I really like is the little quote from Mario Andretti that was on the arrangement on our table, which said, "Desire is the key to motivation, but it's determination and commitment that allow you to attain the success you desire." So, you know, the two big D's, desire and determination, those tools are what I would give you, and you'll probably see in my talk how that plays out. So if I could get the second slide. There we go. So I became an academic instead of going to work for the public, as many of you do. And when I first had my designation as an assistant professor, I became a person who was working for Occidental College. It's in Eagle Rock. I don't know if you guys know where Eagle Rock is. Anybody from Eagle Rock? One or two? Yeah. So for those of you who have never been there, you probably may have driven through it if you've ever driven from Pasadena to Glendale, because it kind of sticks out on the top of LA in between there. And I spent 20 years as a professor there. I arrived in 1973 and my salary was $12,000 a year. That was a great salary in those days, believe it or not, for an academic. And my husband Richard had been a hospital administrator, and I had been doing research in a laboratory in Denver. And he said, "You've been saying you want to teach, and I don't want to do hospital administration anymore. I want to go to law school. So why don't you look for a job, and wherever you find a job, I'll go to law school there." So that's what we did, and he ended up going to Glendale School of Law. And while I was looking for a job, I went ahead and had Lyle. Now, you know, having children, sometimes it's great, you know, you plan and everything's cool, and other times it just happens. And if I had been planning my life with great care, I probably would not have gone out on a job search when I was pregnant. But you can make things work even if you do things like that sometimes. And things did work out pretty well, and I was not hired at University of California, Riverside, or UCLA, or at Colorado State, where I was interviewed. And if you take a look at my book at some point, you'll see the stories of why I didn't end up being hired in some of those places. But I did get an offer from Occidental, and I was excited because I had gone to a small liberal arts college, and I thought this will be kind of a fun experience, pretty similar to that. I didn't negotiate. It turns out that women typically don't negotiate, and I know that you're all employed now, so you don't really need this advice, but there are all kinds of workshops now that people give you on how to negotiate. So if you should ever be looking for another job, I would really suggest that you might consider taking one of those workshops, because negotiation is a skill that men are just great at, almost born that way. Whereas women feel, as Rita was suggesting, that if you just keep your head down and work, they'll notice how good you are and you'll get your reward. And this works sometimes, and other times it doesn't. I'm sorry. Sometimes what happens is the men get the reward and you just keep working and they keep putting in more men over you. So, you know, take a look at how it's shaping up, and if you're getting your reward, as Rita did, then keep doing it, and if not, change your strategy and start negotiating. Okay. I was the only woman in any of the three main science departments, biology, chemistry, and physics. And if I go to the next slide, you're going to see, but I wasn't the first woman to ever be at Occidental College in science. There had been a woman, Hazel Field, who had retired earlier after having been in the department for about 20 years. And I kept, while I was working there, running across slides that she had made, microscope slides. And they would have this beautiful, tiny handwriting, so gorgeous, saying Hazel Field, tiny script. I don't know much about what she did there, but I know a little bit about the other woman who had been there, who was Ann Smith. She was my predecessor. She had been denied tenure. That's how I got the job. And I sort of thought to myself, does that mean this is a women's job and the rest of the jobs aren't? So I was a little curious about that. And as it played out for a while, that seemed to be true. All the new people that were hired were men. But then it started opening up some more, and we got some more women hired into the department. So if we go on to the next slide now. Okay, so research experience at Occidental. I was very well mentored in the job that I had before I went to this school, and I was able to get a big grant from the government, from the National Institutes of Health, to start my research day one when I got to Occidental. I'd already been approved, and all I had to do was set up my lab and go. And what I was working on was something called the error catastrophe theory, which was a suggestion that aging happens when things fall apart, when you start making molecules wrong just by mistake, but then molecules that are made wrong make more molecules wrong, and over time that would just accumulate and accumulate until everything didn't work. And that theory was very dominant at the time. I worked on that for a number of years with my students, and we had a lot of success. But then the National Institutes of Health decided they no longer thought this was a viable theory, and they had a big conference at NIH to sort of evaluate the research and establish some kind of a new direction for studying aging. And I was invited to go, and I thought it was a kudo for me, but it turned out it was a horrible experience because they called us all together, all the people that had been funded, and they basically embarrassed us by bringing in experts who said we should have been doing something else. So that was a really painful experience, and I then did not get the next grant that I applied for. But I had to look around for other places that I could get money, and I found the American Federation for Aging Research and Research Corporation Technologies were willing to fund the kinds of experiments we were doing, and that, so I was able to continue doing research with my students. I had grown up at Goucher College, where undergraduate research was really big. Not anywhere else at that time, but now it seems like it's everywhere, and it's gone across the whole curriculum. So at Pomona we have people, you know, doing undergraduate research in Peru in the summer, or undergraduate research making Japanese prints in Japan, or undergraduate research doing science experiments with me on aging, which I've now switched to studying yeast in aging, and so my students work on that. But it's not just science anymore. But at that time, it was not all that common. And I remember that the president of Occidental called me into his office, and he said, "You have $120,000 from the National Institutes of Health to do research." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You're not spending your time and energy on teaching. This is terrible. We're a teaching college, we can't do this." And so I had I was terrified actually, but I tried to pretend that I was well balanced and had great answers ready and everything. And so I tried my best to convince him that doing research with a faculty member and developing ideas and testing them was showing the students what science was much better than sitting and listening to a sort of a whole collection of facts and things that you have to memorize. And he did not necessarily accept it, but he was moderately polite that time. 10 years later, same president called up and invited me to go with him to a conference at Carleton College to help figure out how to get more money from the NIH to support research at undergraduate colleges. So times do change, and if you are able to keep your courage together and talk, you can sometimes get changes to happen even if your administration doesn't change. During my time at Occidental College, I had a lot of different students, but one of the earliest ones that I had was a brilliant woman who taught me a lesson. She didn't mean to, but she did. This woman, Jo, worked with me, and she did great work in the lab and was a wonderful colleague. I saw her the summer after she graduated from Occidental, and I saw her in a lunchroom, and she had lost about 30 pounds, and she was wearing a white shirt that was tied in the front so her middle was showing, and she had those six-pack ab things, you know, that people have on television. And, and she was a blonde. Her hair was the kind of hair which, if it sees any molecule of water in the air, goes. And she'd had it straight, and it was beautiful, straight blonde hair. And I said, Jo, you look wonderful. And she said, yeah, you know, I have a boyfriend, Billy, and I just want to be, I want to be worthy of him. Oh. So here I am in this restaurant, and this is one of those places where you stand in line to get your sandwich, which is what I was doing. And I thought, I need to sit down with this girl and tell her how much she's worth. She's a fabulous researcher. She's really brilliant, and she's such a good colleague. But I can't tell her all that right now. You know, this is just not the right place and time for that, and da-da-da-da. So I just said, you know, nice to see you, and I went ahead with my collection of food and sat down with my friends and ate, and she did the same. And about a month later, the woman from the chemistry stockroom came down the hall to my office and said, Laura, have you heard that Jo committed suicide? She had stolen chemicals from Occidental, from the chemistry department, and had gone up to the Greek Bowl Theater, where they used to have wonderful summer plays, and she had taken the cyanide and died. And I thought, why would she do that? So that's the first words out of my mouth. And Karen, who had come to tell me that, said, we think it's because her boyfriend Billy broke up with her. You know, that's not ever going to be the only reason why somebody does something like that. There are all kinds of self-esteem issues that have to go along with it. But I just thought, I can't stand not having said anything to her of all the things I was thinking. I can't stand that. And the only way that I can get myself out of the trap of having lived through that and feeling so terrible is to promise myself that I'll try never to do that again. So I've been known to say some things to people in times and places that might not have been their choice. But I feel a lot better. Okay, so one reason why I wrote the memoir that I did was to encourage women in science to think they could have a family. And unlike Rita, you know, I can live through teenage children, but that's another story that we won't even deal with here. So let's go on to the next slide. My family, while I was at Occidental, Richard was going to law school. Lyle, my son, went to a daycare home most of the time. When Lyle was 4, I thought everything was so cool. But all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, Richard had an unexpected heart attack and died. We had not known he had heart disease. And this just happened, and we had to put up with it and cope with it somehow. And it was really terribly difficult, but what I found was that my colleagues were really wonderful. And so another thing that I kind of learned from life experiences, you think that you're just going along parallel tracks with people and they're sort of acquaintances, but they really come through for you when things get really terrible. So you probably have more people you can count on than you realize. I certainly did. And I truly appreciate how well they supported me at the time. So in a couple of months I was back to work and I was doing as well as I could. 4 years later was when they turned down my grant, and I had a sabbatical coming, so I went to the National Institutes of Health Aging Institute, which is in Baltimore at the Baltimore City Hospital. And I took my son, Lyle, who was 8 at the time. And it was kind of an adventure. He was excited to go because they have snow in Baltimore. And he just, he hadn't really gotten to see enough snow. What happened, though, was the first thing that when we got there, I tried to put him in school. He had gone through first grade in Pasadena. His first grade class was a first, second, and third grade bilingual class. Can you imagine? The teacher, Susie Hogue, she was just such a gem of patience. I really can't imagine how she dealt with this. But she had all these kids at all these different levels and speaking both English and Spanish in class. And Lyle loved that class, but he didn't learn very much. And they wanted to put him back through first grade. And I said, well, look, if I was going to stay in Baltimore, that would be fine. But I'm not. I'm going back to LA, and Lyle will then be a year behind all his friends. So after a prolonged negotiation, they agreed to let him go into second grade in Baltimore if I would tutor him every night and try to bring him up to grade level. Well, he's really smart. He's just really kind of easily distracted. So I was able to do that, and we survived with that. Although he said, after the year was over, he said, Mom, you're never going to teach me again, are you? So I'm not sure how much he enjoyed that. But anyway, what happened is that I made him into a mother, please, I'd rather do it myself kid. So it had its good side in that it accomplished what I wanted. He got to come back and be in the right grade when he returned. But at the same time, it gave him a level of independence that caused us trouble a few times later. But that's kids. Okay, another slide of family at Occidental. So I met and married Mike Hoops when I was at the National Institutes of Health. And Mike had been married before, but he had never had any children. Mike he's not too outgoing. And Lyle is a person who, if he should be here, by now he would have met half of you. And you would all love him to death. I mean, he's extremely gregarious. And so the two of them were not an easy mixture. And Mike had never had a kid to raise before. And here was Lyle at 8, thinking he was the king of the world and being very confident and very verbal. And here was Mike being shy, and it was really hard to deal with sometimes. But anyway, we just tried to think, should we stay in Baltimore? Should we go back to LA? And in the end, that's the two-body problem that I deal with so often in my department now, and I dealt with all the time when I was vice president and dean at Pomona. You have somebody that you want for a faculty member, and they have a spouse who can't get a job in the area where you are, and you just have a really hard time dealing with that. But with Mike, he decided that he would quit his civil service job, which is the same as having tenure, really, and I felt really bad about it. And he would come to LA with me, and that's what he did, and he got a job almost right away working at County Hospital, USC. His lab was on the top floor of County Hospital, and he rode his bike to work from Altadena, where we lived, which was 7 miles. Nobody in the world would do this, but he did. And he took his bike up in the elevator in General Hospital and parked it on the roof. And he told me about when there was an earthquake, the whole building just goes, gung, 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 and he was really very seasick up there. But anyway, he did fine. And our daughter Heather was born about 3 years, so I've had one child of each gender. Heather, as she was growing up, she was in daycare homes too, and daycare homes started not wanting you to bring your kid to their place when she was sick. There hadn't been a problem with that when Lyle was little. They hadn't sort of gotten too sophisticated about it, but all of a sudden now, Terry was saying, she can't come because she's sick. And so I worked out some resources. I had some places I could take Heather, but one day none of those resources were available. So I had to take Heather with me to class. And I put her in her sleeping bag on the floor, and I was lecturing about DNA, and Heather was there on the floor. So I would write on the blackboard, and then I would look down and say, "Are you okay?" And she would say, "Yes, Mommy." And then I would go on lecturing and putting my stuff on the board. And at some point she said, "Are you going to step on me?" Real loud. And the whole class goes, and she's going to step on her daughter. But what really is one of the hardest things about kids is what they remember. So even today, she'll say to me, "You remember when you took me to class when I was sick and I had to ask you if you were going to step on me?" It's like, no, I'm never going to step on you, Heather. But it's kind of iconic in our relationship. She now says that she thinks she's grateful that I took her to class with me, not just that time, but a couple of other times when she wasn't sick, to kind of see what I did. And I know they're take your child to school days now, so that's more usual to find probably than it was when I did it. So if we go on to the next slide. Now, with Rita, you almost had a feeling of inevitability that she was going into leadership. With me, I just wanted to keep my head down and do research. I had no interest in being a national leader. However, it got harder and harder to get any grant money. And I really wanted to keep doing research with my students because I thought that was the best way for them to learn. So I got involved in founding the Biology Council of the Council on Undergraduate Research and collecting in all the data for a big directory of people in small colleges and places that didn't have PhD programs who were doing research with their undergraduates and publishing and getting grants. And I became the first female president of CUR and talked them into having open membership instead of being kind of a self-perpetuating little club, and got funding for opening a national office and started up something called April Dialogue, a little smaller than this, but a group which went to Washington, D.C. It was open to anybody from a predominantly undergraduate institution that wanted to know how to set up their research program and get it funded. And we had all the main program officers from the funding agencies in D.C. who would talk with them, give talks, and have little meetings with them to help them figure out about research funding. So in addition to that, though, my friend Chris Craney at Occidental and I got very worried about high school science. And what we saw was econ was doing great in high school. They had all these new computers. Science had old pipettes and spectrophotometers that had been around probably for 40, 50 years, barely worked, scratched old tubes, horrible looking stuff. And we thought, this is not going to attract people to science. So we decided to put together something that would bring fancy new computerized bells and whistles of science to high schools around. And we started something called TOPS, Teachers Plus Occidental Partnerships in Science. And we got an NSF grant. We bought a big panel truck. We bought some equipment. And we hired a full-time teacher from high school science. And we had workshops in the summer where teachers that wanted to use our equipment would come in and help us to put together classes that they would want to use and learn how to use the equipment to do those things. And then during the year, they could book having the equipment come in and be delivered to them. And so that was a program that I always see whenever I go into the government computer programs, that I always smile to see, because I think it's one of the better things that we ever did. The next slide tells you what happened to me next. I thought I was 50, and I thought someday I would probably like to be dean or vice president. And Pomona College is a place that I would like to do that, and they're looking for a dean, and so I'm going to apply, and that way I'll get some great experience that I can use if I ever really am serious about this in the twilight of my career when I'm 60 or something. So what happened was I got the job. I wasn't ready for that. I thought I was just in training. And when I got the offer, I really didn't know what to say. So one thing that I might suggest to you is that if you are interested in applying, and if you're interested in digging deeper, if you're interested in challenging yourself, think through what you're going to do if you actually get selected. Because I was not ready for that, and it was a little bit awkward. However, I did accept the job, and one of the things that I did was to help Pomona diversify its faculty, and we developed a strong undergraduate summer research program across all the disciplines, sort of following on from my own training. So that was a very rewarding experience in some ways and not in other ways. When I had been dean and vice president for 4 years, I got breast cancer. And I would never wish breast cancer on any of you, or any cancer on any of you, but you probably have heard that when you get cancer, cancer is not a phone call that you can put off. It's not, you know, cancer, let me check my schedule. It takes over your life, and it makes you go on a much lower level of activity, such that you have an enormous amount of time to reflect, which you might never have had before. So I realized in those reflections that undergraduate research with students was really what fed me as a person in my job, and I had no longer any of that. So I told the president I was going to step down at the end of the next year and asked him to recruit another person. So he was shocked. He thought I had only been there for 2 years, and I said, no, 4. But anyway, it was okay. I felt that he was disappointed to have me not continue, but I knew at that point I didn't want to be president because I didn't like rich people. And the president has to spend lots and lots of time being nice to rich people who might be racist and sexist and who have a lot of money and think because they do, you have to do what they tell you. I'm letting you in the secret here. So if you want to be president of something, you got to be willing to talk to those people. And I had a hard time with that. I really did. I'm very open, and I don't like to bite my tongue. So anyway, I stepped down, became a faculty member, and I'm having fun again. I'm going to show you 2 more slides fairly quickly. Next one tells you something that I started doing that I got asked to do with no warning, and I've loved it. The journal Nature has an education site called Scitable, S-C-I-T-A-B-L-E, and they asked me to run their Women in Science Forum. And so I've gotten to see a lot of interesting things about the concerns of women who are trying to carry on science in industry and in public arenas and in academia, and get people to discuss their issues and help each other. So that's been great. And let's do the last slide. Okay, so as they said in my introduction, I am learning anew now. So I have taken up trying to move into creative writing, as I'm about doing a phased retirement now. And I have gone to UCLA for a while, and now I'm going to San Diego State and working on an MFA program. And I've written this memoir. I'm also writing some novels, and if you guys are really interesting and I talk to you, you might end up in my novels. You never know. So thank you very much for your attention, and I encourage you all to enjoy leadership and think about family.